moving, moving, moving between the worlds, moving, moving, moving between the worlds. She brings forth all things from within her body. She brings forth all things from within her body. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. He brings forth all things from within his body. He brings forth all things from within his body. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. We bring forth all things from within our bodies. We bring forth all things from within our bodies. Sha! Welcome. Today we are going to explore the topic of women's spirituality then and now, moving between the worlds. So what are the worlds we're going to move through and move between today? Well, we're going to move between the worlds of embodied spirituality, Ukrainian matriarchal cultures and contemporary Ukrainian culture, Italian Marxism, and Native American cultures. So it's going to be quite a journey. Here we go. When I was doing my doctoral work at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, several years ago in 1994, one of my professors, Dr. Lucia Schiavola Birnbaum, made a very challenging statement to all of us women. She said, unless you know your matriarchal heritage, you cannot really call yourself feminist. So all of us were kind of shocked at that because about all I knew about my matriarchal heritage at that point, my mother line, was that my mother was from Ukraine. And I knew that Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union. I knew that my mother used to have a mantra saying, we are Ukrainians, we're not Russians. I didn't understand why she said that, but that was about it. And this was in 1994. The Soviet Union had started to break up in 1991, and Ukraine was actually the first country that demanded and achieved its independence. So I really didn't know a lot about the cultures that had preceded Ukraine. So my father was French Canadian. He was raised Roman Catholic. My mother was Ukrainian. She was raised Ukrainian Catholics. And so in our family, we celebrated two Christmases, December 25th for my father's heritage and January 7th for my mother's heritage. But as important and as fun as Christmas was, the larger and more important celebration in our home was the celebration of Easter. And I owe that to my mother, whose picture is on the table behind me, because she understood that what Easter was really about was not death and resurrection, but death and regeneration. Easter in the Ukrainian Catholic tradition understood that, like things in nature, the seed falls into the ground and it dies, its form changes. And in that death, new forms come forth. So there's a regeneration of life. Death is not seen as evil or demonic in matriarchal cultures as it is in patriarchy and in patriarchal cultures. Death is often feared in patriarchal cultures because there's a fear that there'll be punishment by an angry male god. Matriarchal cultures understand it differently. They simply see that death is part of that natural cycle of life. And so when I started understanding that, and understanding that we had these certain practices of foods we made and things that we did, I got very interested in studying deeper the history of Ukraine. And what I began to find was that the history of Ukraine is part of the history of what Antonio Gramsci, who was a 20th century Sardinian Marxist theorist, he widened the understanding of exploitation beyond economics to encompass what he called the negation of cultures of subordinate peoples or dark others. And he understood that because so many of the people that he saw in his native Italy who were subordinated and whose culture was negated were the people in the southern part of Italy, from Sardinia, from the more southern part of Italy. And they were oppressed and denigrated by people in the north. So he began looking at this what he called the north-south dynamic. It was very easy to understand and see that in the dynamics between Russia in the north and Ukraine in the south. In fact, the word in Russian for Ukrainian would equate to what we call the N-word in our culture. It was a very derogatory term. And some of that had to do with the fact that Ukrainians were predominantly a farming culture. Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Eastern Europe. Their soil was that rich black soil that grew wheat. And so they basically grew crops that were responsible for feeding most of Eastern Europe. But as often happens in patriarchy, those who are connected with the earth are seen as less valuable, less important than those who work in cities and who are earning paychecks that have nothing to do with nature. So he wrote about that in his prison letters. And so I began to understand and see more of a perception that also Ukraine had a history of partition and division. In fact, the word Ukraine means borderlands because the lands on their western borders were taken over by so many different countries, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Poland, different countries. And so there was this whole thing of we don't really have an ownership of our lands. We're constantly being moved off them by other peoples. Ukrainian women have lived through the repeated death and regeneration of their country, which, as I said, as of 1991, became an independent state. The complex history of feminism in Ukraine is the story of women whose culture, with its roots in ancient matriarchal cultures, has been continuously negated by the dominant culture of Russia. Gramsci pointed out a very important truth, that until the stories of these submerged, negated cultures are tapped and their wisdom is incorporated and integrated into the wisdom of the total community, there can be no actual, authentic cultural transformation. Feminists came to understand and appreciate that in the patriarchal paradigm, woman's culture and women's bodies are also a negated culture. And so there was an embrace in the early days of the 1970s and 1980s in the United States of Gramscian understandings into feminism. So I would like to talk now a little bit about how Ukraine has its roots in two very rich matriarchal cultures, which are thousands of years old and which celebrated the great goddess in all of her guises. The first culture is the Trypillian culture in Western Ukraine. That culture lasted from 4800 BCE to 3000 BCE. And that designation, BCE, is coming from historians that began to look for how to widen what we mean by history. And so BCE meant before the Common Era, CE meant the Common Era. So instead of having it be history described in terms of the Western Christian paradigm understandings, BCE and CE incorporated more religions and more cultures that were not Christian. So the second culture is what is called the Dnieper-Donets civilization in eastern Ukraine, because it incorporates those two rivers, the Dnieper River and the Donets River. And that culture also reflected the social order in which women played a central role as heads of clans. They were also responsible for food production and for anything that had to do with nature. Their role was not seen as dominant to that of men in their culture, but simply distinct. In matriarchal cultures, woman's body is considered sacred, and the deep wisdom of culture is oftentimes passed on through arts that involve activities of the body. So in Ukraine, those sacred arts included the art of embroidery and pisanki. And the word pisank or pisanki in Ukrainian means writing on eggs. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about those two arts. Implanted deep within the female psyche, the trillion sacred images and symbols were passed down from mother to daughter in their embroidery patterns and in the pisanki patterns. Many dowries contained large amounts of textile materials which carried the iconography of goddesses on these items of clothing. I visited Ukraine in 1997. I went to Cherkasy, which is on the Dnieper River. It's in central Ukraine, and I was asked to share the research that I was doing. And so I went to a place called the Cherkasy Women's Center, and as I started talking about these ancient cultures, women came back the next day and they brought some of their textiles. They brought things that look like what I'm wearing, which is called a rushniki. They brought tablecloths. They brought garments, and we began together to share this knowledge of what these symbols meant. So one of the most important embroidered textiles in Ukrainian life is the ritual tower or rushnik. And you're seeing that right in front of you. These towels were used for all occasions of importance in Ukrainian life, as well as for covering icons, windows, and tables. In modern Ukrainian households, as well as the households in the past, the bread, which is usually made in a round form, is covered with an embroidered towel. The rushniki that I'm wearing today, I brought back from Kiev when I visited Ukraine. How were these towels used? Well, they were tied to poles and to trees and to the horns of oxen. They were tied to the house beam for the woman to pull on when she was giving birth, because usually birth was done at home. And they were also grave markers in cemeteries. The ritual cloth was used as a sacred item in all important rituals that were connected with marriage and menstruation and birth and death. Although these customs and traditions varied according to regions, in Ukraine, the rushniki performed that important ritual function for all of them. When I was visiting in Kiev in 1997, the one person I was traveling with said, let's go into this church. So we walked into a Ukrainian Catholic church and a wedding was going on. So I moved toward the front to see what was going on, and here was a rushniki that was a silk rushniki, and it was placed at the feet of the bride and groom. So at the first steps that they took together as a couple were onto that sacred towel, that sacred cloth that has such ancient connections to the Dnieper, Donets, and Trillian cultures. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about pisanki. Many of you listening may know about Ukrainian eggs and Ukrainian egg decorating. You may have seen some of these before. I have a couple here today that are made out of wood, which means that they don't really break. And you'll see the variety of nature designs that are on these eggs. So let me say a little bit about what the designs are and where they come from. This is another way that the symbolic designs from these cultures have been preserved. Pisanki means, it comes from the Ukrainian word pysat, P-Y-S-A-T-Y, which means to write. And the pisanki are made from raw, fertile eggs, which are obviously never eaten. The symbolic designs are actually written on the egg with a very fine pointed stylus. The stylus is dipped in beeswax, after which the egg is put into, and then it's written, the designs are made on the egg, and then the egg is dipped in dye baths. The usual colors in traditional Pasanki were red, yellow, black, and white, which were also the dominant colors of the Rushniki. And they're also the dominant colors in the Native American fourfold way, which I'll say a little bit more about later. These archaeological excavations in Ukraine actually showed that the art of Pasanki was practiced several thousand years before the Christian era. So that when you see Pasanki today that have crosses on them, that's really coming after a time when Christianity was imposed upon the matriarchal cultures of Ukraine. A ceramic egg dating back to 1300 BCE showed the same kind of wavy designs and decorations as the motifs that are used by Ukrainian Pasanki artists today. We have a couple examples of those Pasanki with the traditional tropillion designs. One that has a female figure on it at the very top above the band of black color. And then another one that's on a very large ostrich egg. And you can see the designs of the spirals, the wavy lines, the animal, which is probably a dog because the dog was considered very close to the earth and a sacred animal in the culture, and bordered dots. And you can see the eggs that are right above where the dog is. So there's also a basket of contemporary Pasanki with a very wide range of colors. And when I visited the Folklore Museum in Kiev, there was a very large room that was entirely devoted to Pasanki. And as the Rushniki designs kind of designate a different district, so the Pasanki designs designate different districts of Ukraine. So in Ukraine, the art of making a Pasanka was considered a holy and ritual task. The power of the egg was considered to be so strong that it was important to prepare not only the egg, but the Pisancharki, which was the Ukrainian name for the woman who was decorating the egg. So there was a whole ritual where all kinds of conflicting energies were to be released and to be gotten rid of before the Pisancharka began to make her egg. She only made the designs at night after everyone had gone to bed, and she was required to be in a very deep meditative state to bring forth these designs. Myrna, a Ukrainian woman in Canada who's teaching her daughters to do Pasanki, said this about what it means to her. When you look at the embroideries and the costumes and the Easter egg designs and our weaving from an artistic point of view, they were just ordinary women who created them. But they are very beautiful, complicated designs, which I'm sure you can appreciate as you look at these eggs. I have never felt that our women were ordinary. Many were geniuses to do the things they did, especially when you consider that they were oppressed in the old country. But they survived because, as Myrna said, we're survivors. A key theme of embodied spirituality is that woman's body is sacred and the site of the encounter with the sacred feminine, which means the creative life force manifesting as female. Women's arts, therefore, are considered sacred, and in performing them, women are manifesting and bringing forth themselves as the sacred feminine. Performing these ritual acts and ritual arts, in doing so, a woman discovers that her matriarchal lineage is alive in her cells. Recently, I've been interested in studying Native American culture. I, about a year ago at this time, was at Standing Rock, North Dakota, where I went to be in service and support of Native Americans, who I'd met and lived and taught at their school at United Tribes Technical College when I lived in Bismarck and Mandan for over 12 years. So as I began studying Native American cultures, I began to see some parallels between my Ukrainian history and Native American history and culture, and I'd like to just share with you some of these parallels that I'm seeing. Native American culture is a negated culture in the United States in terms of Gramsci's understanding. Many American Native Native American tribes are matriarchal or matrilineal, as are the cultures that sourced Ukraine. Some of those cultures that are matrilineal are the Hopi, the Navajo, the Iroquois, and the Chickasaw, to name just a few. For the past 500 years, the goal of the United States government has been to eradicate Native Americans. In fact, the statement that's made by a lot of people I met at Standing Rock is, "Our existence is our resistance. We are still here." The matriarchal cultures of Ukraine, which were the indigenous cultures that sourced Ukraine, were also eradicated by patriarchal cultures. But to bring us up to more contemporary times, during World War II, the Soviet government under Stalin attempted to eradicate Ukrainians through systematic starvation, which is known in Ukraine, in a Ukrainian language, as the Holodomor. That means, in Ukrainian, death by starvation. Ukrainian losses, one scholar states, resulting from the famine of 1932 to 1933, totaled no fewer than 10 million people. The Soviet genocide against Ukraine and its people consisted of a four-pronged attack: the destruction of the Ukrainian intellectual class, or the brains of the nation, the annihilation of the Church of Ukraine, which was the soul of the people, the methodological elimination of Ukrainian peasant farmers, which was the heart of the nation, and the dispersion of the Ukrainian people and the replacement by others. The attempt to eradicate Native Americans included many of that same four-pronged approach through the destruction and the murder of elders and chiefs, as well as the horrendous destruction of the future of the nation through boarding schools, which attempted to, as the quote went, kill the Indian and save the man. It was also made illegal to practice Native American ceremonies and religion, which was an attempt to annihilate the soul of the people. The elimination of lands for traditional methods of food production and dispersion of Native American peoples through the creation of reservations and replace them with white settlers was also a form of starvation. People could not have access to their food sources in the ways that they had done traditionally, and many Native Americans starved to death because of that. For both Ukrainians and Native Americans, the erasure of language was central to the eradication of culture. In Ukraine, even to this day, there are reports of people who get beaten up by others, by Russians, by others who consider that a language of oppressed people. And when I visited Ukraine, women told me that they were reclaiming their language. So in both Native American cultures and Ukraine today, the project of language reclamation is very much alive and very much oftentimes headed and led by women. As I researched Native American women change makers, I found another similarity to Ukrainian culture and Native American culture in that women are playing and have played a central role in the revival and transformation of these negated cultures. While I was in Ukraine, I spent time at something called the Cherkasy Women's Center, where women were actively creating classes to help women learn computer and leadership skills, and also offering counseling services to deal with the increased rates of alcoholism and domestic violence as a result of the shift from the communist and socialist government into a capitalist culture. Native American women were at the heart of the water protective movement at Standing Rock, as were the young women who had the vision for creating a prayer camp and doing runs. And they came to the Native American women elders and began to lead that movement. They also have been doing work in language reclamation, education, and social justice. If you're interested in learning more about Native American women changemakers, I invite you to come to a class, an 8-session class that I will be teaching at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, known as OLLI, in January of 2018. And we'll explore this topic in more depth, both Native American women changemakers in the past and those who are with us now. There is deep wisdom in the words of Nina Simons when she says, "Women's ascent is occurring in every part of the globe, and this emergence is among the most hopeful trends today." Perhaps Nina says the rising of women around the world is the Earth's own immune system kicking in. And I really like that because it attends to the fact that the Earth is alive. The Earth is not a dead form of matter to be exploited, but that perhaps the rising of women around the globe is the Earth's own immune system kicking in. So I'd like to invite you to join me to sing the chant that we started with today. And I know you're just anxious to do that, so here we go. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. She brings forth all things from within her body. Oh, yes, she does. She brings forth all things from within her body. Men, join me. Moving, moving, move between the worlds. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. He brings forth all things from within his body. Oh, yes, he does. He brings forth all things from within his body. Everyone, moving, moving, moving between the worlds. Moving, moving, moving between the worlds. We bring forth all things from within our bodies. Oh, yes, we do. We bring forth all things from within our bodies. Ta! Thank you very much.